the remote was in Nikki's car. Okay, so we're trying to sort out the car because we just picked it up from the dealership today, and fun. It just died. It died. It just refuses to start. So yeah. Joy. And yeah, it's got me pissed off. Because it's brand new. Less than 100 kilometers on the clock. Literally less than 100. So, yeah, life is wonderful. Yeah, today we are reading Orientalism by Edward Saïd, and let's get into it. How is everyone? All of you could please share the live, do the things, because my main account was nannered. Yeah, I'm just trying to share the live out with people, see, who can actually come in here, because I don't know who I even still have on this account. I see a whole lot of people I no longer talk to that I follow on this one. Fun. So how is everybody? Are you guys all right? I haven't got a clue. about where my head is at right now. So please, share the live out with peoples, because I'm a little bit, annoyed. Okay, now the husband is off the phone. I can actually do this. Glasses would be good. We're looking at cultural representations of how over Asia, the hostile other world beyond the seas. To Asia are given the feelings of emptiness, loss, and disaster that seemed thereafter to reward Oriental challenges of the West, and also to lament some glorious past that Asia fared better and was itself victorious over Europe. So this romanticized idea of the Oriental is something that exists only really in the imagination. Thank you. Hi, JJ. This romanticized idea is something that only really exists in the imagination of the Orientalist, the Western person who has either never been there or has had very little dealings with the Orient. I always say it quote unquote, and who imagines it as this either a barren wasteland or a kind of a place that with so much mystique that nobody can possibly understand it. In the Bacchae, perhaps the most Asiatic of all Attic dramas, Dionysus is explicitly connected with his Asian origins and with the strangely threatening excesses of Oriental mysteries. So how we imagine the flowing of alcohol and the scantily clad woman who looked like Jasmine from Aladdin, and this time long lost. Pentheus, king of Thebes, is destroyed by his mother, Agave, and her fellow Bacchantes. Having defied Dionysus by not recognizing either his power or divinity, Pentheus is horribly punished, and the play ends with a gentle recognition of the eccentric god's terrible power. Modern commentators on the Bacchae have not failed to note the play's extraordinary range of intellectual and aesthetic effects, but there has been no escaping the additional historical detail that Euripides was surely affected by the new aspect that the Dionysic cults have assumed in the light of the foreign ecstatic religions of the Bendes, Cybele, Sabazius, Adonis, Isis, which were introduced from Asia Minor and the Levant and swept through the Piraeus and Athens during the frustrating and increasingly irrational years of the Peloponnesian War. So this is where we came to last time. The idea of war as being this magnificent thing is a constant theme in Asiatic study. Like, the Persian Empire is always represented as having been at war. And it's kind of annoying, actually. But all warfare that is depicted the Asian people, the Oriental people, are depicted as being warmongering, savage people with no reason to go to war. And Western wars are always seen as reasonable. The two aspects of the Orient that set it off from the West in this pair of plays will remain essential motives of European imaginative geography. A line is drawn between two continents. Europe is powerful and articulate, Asia is defeated and distant. Ecclesias represents Asia, makes her speak in the person of the aged Persian queen Xerxes' mother. It is Europe that articulates the Orient. The articulation is the prerogative, not the puppet master, but a genuine creator whose life-giving power represents, animates, and constitutes the otherwise silent and dangerous space beyond familiar boundaries. There is an analogy between Ecclesias' orchestra, which contains the Asiatic world as the playwright conceives it, and then the learned envelope of Orientalist scholarship, which will also hold the vast amorphous Asiatic sprawl for sometimes sympathetic but always dominating scrutiny. Secondly, there is a motive of the Orient as insinuating danger. Rationality is undermined by Eastern excesses, those mysteriously attractive opposites to what seem to be normal values. The difference separating East from West is symbolized in the sternness with which, at first, Pentheus rejects the hysterical Bacchants. When later he himself becomes one, he is destroyed not so much for having given in to for having given in to Dionysus, as for having incorrectly assessed the menace in the first place. The lesson that Euripides intends is dramatized by the presence in the play of Cadmus and Tiresias, knowledgeable older men who realize that sovereignty alone does not rule men, that there is such a thing as judgment, they say, which means sizing up correctly the force of alien powers and expertly coming to terms with them. Hereafter, Oriental mysteries will be taken seriously, not at least because they challenge the rational Western mind to new exercises of its enduring ambition and power. Every bit of literature we see coming from any culture is meant to represent the best and the worst of that culture. And when something is pitted against the culture that is writing it, like in the 80s, it was Russia. That was, the US was always pitted against the threat of, of the communists. JJ, let me mod you here. I can't mod you. Oh, come on. There. But one big division, as between West and Orient, leads to other smaller ones, especially as the normal enterprises of civilization provoke such outgoing activities as travel, conquest, new experiences. In classical Greece and Rome, geographers, historians, public figures like Caesar, orators and poets added to the fund of taxonomic law, separating races, regions, nations, and minds from each other, and much of that was self-serving, and existed to prove that Romans and Greeks were superior to any other kind of people. And so every single piece of literature that we see coming out of the West is always to exalt their own existence. Even in a critique of somebody in the West, it's still always that they're the heroes, that the people they are fighting, the people they are up against, are these people who need to be civilized. But concern with the Orient had its own tradition of classification and hierarchy. From at least the 2nd century BC on, it was lost on no traveller or eastward-looking and ambitious Western potentate that Herodotus, historian, traveller, inexhaustibly curious chronicler, and Alexander, king, warrior, scientific conqueror, had been to the Orient before. The Orient was therefore subdivided into realms previously known, visited, conquered by Herodotus and Alexander, as well as their epigenies, and those realms not previously known, visited, and conquered. I am one of those people who reads a word, only ever sees it written, and never knows how to pronounce it, so my apologies. Christianity completed the setting up of the main intra-Oriental spheres. There was the Near Orient and the Far Orient, the Familiar Orient, which René Gosson calls l'Empire du Levant, a novel Orient. The Orient, therefore, alternated in the mind's geography between being an old world to which one returned, as to Eden or paradise, there to set up a new version of the old, and being a wholly new place to which one came as Columbus came to America in order to set up a new world, although ironically Columbus himself thought that he discovered a part of the old world. Certainly neither of these Orients were purely one thing or the other. It is their vacillations, their tempting suggestiveness, their capacity for entertaining and confusing the mind that became interesting. Thank you. Consider how the Orient, and in particular the Near Orient, became known to the West as its great complementary opposite since antiquity. There were the Bible and the rise of Christianity, and travelers like Marco Polo who charted trade routes and patterned a regulated system of commercial exchange, and after him Ludovico di Varthema and Pietro del Valle, and they were fabulous like Mandeville. There was the redoubtable conquering of Eastern movements, principally Islam, of course, and the militant pilgrims, chiefly the Crusaders. Altogether, an eternally destructive archive is built up from the literature that belongs to these experiences. Out of this comes a restricted number of typical encapsulations: the journey, history, fable, the stereotype, the polemical confrontation. These are the lenses through which the Orient is experienced, and they shape the language, perception, and form of the encounter between East and West. What gives the immense number of encounters unity, however, is the vacillation I was speaking about earlier. Something patently foreign and distant acquires, for some reason or the other, a status more or less familiar. One tends to stop judging things either as completely novel or completely well-known. A new median category emerges, a category that allows one to see new things, things seen for the first time, as versions of previously known things. So yes, it could be previously known, but the way in which it's framed is constantly through this old lens of we need to keep it this way, else it would be it would be sullied if we don't maintain it in this or that way. In essence, such a category is not so much a way of receiving new information as it is a method of controlling what seems to be a threat of the old established view of things. If the mind must suddenly deal with what it takes to be a radically new form of life as Islam appeared to Europe in the Middle Ages, the response on the whole is conservative and defensive. Islam is judged to be a fraudulent new version of some previous experience, in this case Christianity. The threat is muted. The familiar values impose themselves, and in the end the mind reduces the pressure upon it by accommodating things to itself. My apologies. The threat is muted. Familiar values impose themselves, and in the end, the mind reduces the pressure upon it by accommodating things to itself as either original or repetitious. Islam is thereafter handled. Its novelty and suggestiveness are brought under control so that relatively nuanced discriminations are now made that would have been impossible had the raw novelty of Islam been left unattended. Islam is a threat to Christianity. Islam is a threat to Christianity's control, and we still see it today, where people who believe in the Abrahamic gods, or God, are not they're disillusioned by Christianity as a colonial construct, as a colonial form of control. But they don't want to let go of their belief in God, their belief in, or their faith, so to speak, in the Abrahamic Holy Trinity. So what do? They can't really turn to what is considered European Judaism that has been spread throughout the world, because, as we've seen throughout the global south, brown people who convert to Judaism are not exactly welcomed by Europeanized white Jewish people. And what is the welcoming religion out of the Abrahamics? It's Islam. And Islam starts making sense. Islam is a threat, is an existential threat to Christianity's domination. The Orient at large, therefore, vacillates between the West's contempt for what is familiar and shivers in delight or fear of its novelty. Yet where Islam was concerned, European fear, if not always respect, was in order. After Muhammad, peace be upon him's death in 632, the military and later the cultural and religious hegemony of Islam grew enormously. Persia, Syria, then Egypt and Turkey, North Africa, fell into the Muslim armies in the 8th and 9th centuries, Spain, Sicily, and parts of France. By 13th and 14th centuries, Islam ruled as far east as India, Indonesia, and China. And to this extraordinary assault, Europe could only respond with very little except fear and a kind of awe. Christian authors witnessing the Islamic conquest had scant interest in learning, high culture, and the frequent magnificence of Muslims who were, as Gibbon said, coeval with the darkest and most slothful period of European annals. But with some satisfaction he added, since the sum of science has risen in the West, it should seem that the Oriental studies have languished and declined. What Christians typically felt about Eastern armies was that they had all the appearance of a swarm of bees, but with a heavy hand they devastated everything. So wrote Eckenbert, a cleric in Monte Cassino in the 11th century. Not for nothing did Islam come to symbolize terror, devastation, and demonic hordes of hated barbarians. Because it was a threat to Western hegemony. For Europe, Islam was a lasting trauma. Until the end of the 17th century, the Ottoman peril lurked alongside Europe to represent for the whole of Christian civilization a constant danger, and in time European civilization incorporated that peril into its law in great events. They say that the Ottoman Empire was an empire that was barbaric, that was ruthless and so oppressive to its people. No, it wasn't. People were chilled in the Ottoman Empire. They have figures, virtues, and vices, and something woven into the fabric of life. In Renaissance England alone, Samuel Chu recounts in his classic study, The Crescent and the Rose, a man of average education and intelligence had at his fingertips and could watch the London stage a relatively large number of detailed events in the history of Ottoman Islam and its encroachment upon Christian Europe. The point is that what remained current about Islam was some necessarily diminished version of those great, dangerous forces that it symbolized for Europe. Much like Walter Scott's Saracens, and the European representation of the Muslim, Ottoman, or Arab was always a way of controlling the redoubtable Orient, and to a certain extent, the same is true of methods on contemporary learned Orientalists, whose subject is not so much the East itself as with the East being made known, therefore less fearsome to the Western reading public. There's nothing especially controversial or reprehensible about such domestications of the exotic, They take place between all cultures, certainly between all men. My point, however, is to emphasize the truth that Orientalists, as much as anyone in the European West who thought about or experienced the Orient, performed this kind of mental operation. What he is saying is 1970s academic speak for mental gymnastics. But what is more important still is the limited vocabulary and imagination that impose themselves as a consequence. The reception of Islam in the West is not a perfect case in point and has been admirably studied by Norman Daniel. One constraint acting upon Christian thinkers who tried to understand Islam was an analogical one. Since Christ is the basis of Christian faith, it was assumed, quite incorrectly, that Muhammad, peace be upon him, was to Islam as Christ is to Christianity. Hence the polemic name Mohammedanism, given to Islam, and the automatic epithet impostor applied to Muhammad, peace be upon him. Out of such and many other misconceptions, there formed a circle which was never broken by imaginative exteriorization. The Christian concept of Islam was integral and self-sufficient. Islam became an image. The word is Daniel's, but it seems to have a remarkable implication for Orientalism in general, whose function was not so much to represent Islam in itself as to represent it for the medieval Christian. The West is always representing things in relation to itself. Yes, we represent the things that we know. We represent the things that we understand. We represent the things that we can speak to. And, hey, Oya. We represent the things that in relation to what we can speak to, right? However, the invariable tendency to neglect what the Quran meant, or what Muslims thought it meant, or what Muslims thought or did in any given circumstance, necessarily implies that Quranic and other Islamic doctrine was presented in a form that would convince Christians, and more extravagant forms would stand a chance of acceptance as the distance of the writers and the public of the Islamic border increased. It was with great reluctance that Muslims said that Muslims believed was accepted as what they did believe. There was a Christian picture in which the details, even under the pressure of facts, were abandoned as little as possible, and in which the general outline was never. There are shades of difference, but only with a common framework. All the corrections that were made in the interest of an increasing accuracy were the only defense of what had newly been realized to be vulnerable, a shoring up of weakened structure. Christian opinion was an erection that could not be demolished, even to be rebuilt. He said erection. Who would think I'm 41 years old, guys? Thank you, Danny. The Islam that has been created in the Western mind. This is my backup. My main live access got. Unfortunately. Still appealing. The account is still there. I just can't go live. Like it says live access is permanently taken away. I know. I was just like, seriously? Seriously? Is it because that I mentioned that I've had that account since Musical.ly days? Yeah. So the myth that has been perpetuated about Islam by the Western mind, by the Western consciousness, is a case of, here is the threat. This is why it is a threat, because it is the opposite of what we are. It misrepresents Islam. How many of you have learnt over the past few years that Islam is actually not what you learnt it to be? How many of you have come to understand that it actually is quite different? Because we were told that it was a certain way. We were told that it was this repressive thing. We were told that Sharia is this and that and whatnot. We were told lies. Even when it came to something like as beautiful as Arabic, we were told that Allahu Akbar is a call to kill people. Allahu Akbar means God is great. People became fearful of something that is so accepted to say in English, but not acceptable to say in Arabic. We were told that the language is grating to the ears because it's full of hacks and guttural sounds. That's Hebrew, by the way. Hello, my love. Islam is wonderful. Allah Akbar. Even the greeting, peace be upon you. Don't people say that in church? Just in English? Oh, God be with you. The response, wa alaikum salam. And peace be upon you too. Is that not, and also with you? Folks, Palestinian Jewish people of the Levant, before Israel came and fucked shit up, Christian people in the Levant, everybody whose first language is Arabic, no matter what their religion, they all refer to God as Allah. Oh, Jaguar, yes, we have a mosque within azan distance. So when I hear the azan in the morning, when I'm working late into the night, I'm like, oh, it is time for me to go to bed because it is almost 5 a.m. And then by the third azan of the day, that's time for me to get up again. Just like church bells are a solemn call to... Thanks, Cole. I love you too. The rigorous Christian picture of Islam was intensified in innumerable ways, including during the Middle Ages and early Renaissance, a large variety of poetry, learned controversy, and popular superstition. By this time, the Near Orient had been all but incorporated into the common world picture of Latin Christianity, as in the Chanson de Roland, the worship of the Saracens, portrayed by embracing Muhammad and Apollo. By the middle of the 15th century, as R.W. Southern has brilliantly shown, it became apparent to the serious European thinker that something would have to be done about Islam, which had turned the situation. Southern recounts a dramatic episode between 1450 and 1460, when the four learned men, John of Segovia, Nicholas of Cusa, Jean Germain, and Aeneas Sylvius, or Pius II, attempted to deal with Islam through conferentia, or conference. The idea was John of Segovia's. It had to be a staged conference with Islam and Christians, where they attempted wholesale conversion of Muslims into Christianity. He saw the conference as an instrument with a political as well as strictly religious function, and in words that will strike a chord in modern breasts, he exclaimed, and that even if it were to last 10 years, it would be less expensive and less damaging than war. This was no agreement between the four men, but the episode is crucial for having been a fairly sophisticated attempt, part of a general European attempt from Bede to Luther, to put a representative Orient in front of Europe, to stage the Orient and Europe together in some coherent way, the idea being for Christians to make it clear to Islam that it was just a misguided version of Christianity. And they can't even fucking dabke. Southern's conclusion follows. Most conspicuous to the inability of any of these systems of thought, European Christian, to provide a fully satisfying explanation of the phenomenon they had set out to explain, of Islam, still less to influence the course of practical events in a decisive way. At a practical level, events turned out either so well or so ill that the most intelligent observers predicted. And it is perhaps worth noticing that they never turned out better than when the best judges confidently expected a happy ending. Was there any progress in Christian knowledge of Islam? I must express my conviction that there was. Even if the solution of the problem maintained obstinately hidden from sight, the statement of the problem became more complex, more rational, and more related to experience. The scholars who labored at the problem of Islam in the Middle Ages failed to find a solution they sought and desired, but they developed habits of mind and powers of comprehension which, in other fields, may yet deserve success. The best part of Southern's analysis here and elsewhere in his brief history of Western views of Islam is his demonstration that it is finally Western ignorance which becomes more refined and complex. It's just become, the mental gymnastics have just become more wordy, I feel. Not some body of positive Western knowledge which increases in size and accuracy, for fictions have their own logic and dialectic for growth or decline. Unto the character of Muhammad in the Middle Ages, peace be upon him, was heaped a bundle of attributes that corresponded to the character of the 20th century prophets, of the free spirit who actually did arise in Europe and claim credence and collect followers. Simply since the prophet, peace be upon him, was viewed as a disseminator of false revelation, he became as well at the epitome of lechery, debauchery, sodomy, and the whole battery of assorted treacheries, all of which derived logically from his doctrinal impostures. So they're like, oh, Muhammad, peace be upon him, is a false prophet. Let's label him as everything that we are supposedly not. Meanwhile, the Catholic Church has sexual crime insurance. Thus, the Orient acquired representatives, so to speak, and representations, each one more concrete, more internally congruent with some Western exigency than the ones that preceded it, as if, having settled once in the Orient and a locale suitable for incarnating the infinite in a finite shape, Europe could not stop the practice. The Orient and Oriental, Arab, Islamic, Indian, Chinese, or whatever became repetitious pseudo-incarnations of some great original. Christ, Europe, the West, they were supposed to have been imitating. Only the source of these, rather narcissistic Western ideas about the Orient changed in time, not character. Thus we will find it commonly believed in the 12th and 13th centuries that Arabia was on the fringe of the Christian world, a natural asylum for heretical outlaws, and that Muhammad, peace be upon him, was a cunning apostate, whereas in the 20th century an Orientalist scholar, an erudite specialist, would be the one to point out how Islam is really no more than a second-order Arian heresy. What exhausts me, one of the things that exhausts me, I should say, is the Western penchant for posturing the West as the original. So if you read about Rabindranath Tagore was an absolutely amazing, brilliant Indian writer. Wrote literature beyond what anybody in the West could actually imagine writing. Obviously, translated into English, it loses some of its potency. But even though he lived such a different life from Shakespeare, he is called India's Shakespeare. Why? No, he's not India's Shakespeare. Shakespeare is Shakespeare. What he is Rabindranath Tagore. Our initial description of Orientalism as a learned field now acquires a new concreteness. The field is often an enclosed space, the idea of representation a theatrical one. The Orient is the stage on which the whole East is confined, appearing figures whose role is to represent the larger whole from which they emanate. And that happens all the time. The Orient then seems to be not an unlimited extension beyond the familiar European world, but a closed field, a theatrical stage affixed to Europe. An Orientalist is but the particular specialist in knowledge for which Europe at large is responsible, and in the way an audience is historically and culturally responsible for in responsiveness to dramas technically put together by the dramatist. In the depths of this Oriental stage stands a prodigious cultural repertoire whose individual items evoke a fabulously rich world. The Sphinx, Cleopatra, Eden, Troy, Sodom and Gomorrah, Astarte, Isis, Osiris, Sheba, Babylon, the genie, the Magi. Out the East is never advancing. It is just in service of itself, constantly regurgitating old stereotypes, so that Western hegemony is not under threat. A celebrated instance of how dramatic form and learned imagery come together in the Orientalist theatre is Barthélemy de Hebalt's Bibliothèque Orientale, published posthumously in 1697 with a preface by Antoine Galland. The introduction of the recent Cambridge History of Islam considers Bibliothèque, along with George Sale's preliminary discourse into his translation of the Quran in 1734, and Simon Ockley's History of the Saracens, 1708 and 1718, to be highly important in widening the new understanding of Islam and conveying it to the less academic readership. This inadequately describes Hebalt's work, which was not restricted to Islam as Sale's and Ockley's were, with the exception of Hottinger's Historia Orientalis, which appeared in 1651. The Bibliothèque remained as the standard reference work in Europe until the 19th century. Its scope was truly epochal. Galland, who was the first European translator of the 1001 Nights, and an Arabist of note, contrasted Hebalt's achievement with every prior one, noting the prestigious and prodigious range of his enterprise. D'Herbelot read a great number of works, Galland said, in Arabic, Persian, and Turkish, with the result that he was able to find out more about matters hitherto concealed from Europeans. After first composing a dictionary of 3 Oriental languages, D'Herbelot went on to study Oriental history, theology, geography, science, and art in their fabulous and truthful varieties. Thereafter he decided to compose 2 works, one, a bibliothèque or library, an alphabetically arranged dictionary, and second, a florilège or anthology. Only the first part was ever completed. Galland's account of the Bibliothèque stated that the Oriental was planned to include principally the Levant, although Galland says admiringly the time period covered did not begin only with the creation of Adam and ended with le temps où nous sommes, the times that we are with. D'Herbelot went even further back, to a time prescribed as Plaçot in fabulous histories, to the long period of pre-Adamite Solomons. As Galland's description proceeds, we learn that the Bibliothèque was like any other history of the world, for what it attempted was a complete compendium of the knowledge available on such matters as the creation, the deluge, the destruction of Babel, and so forth, with the difference that his sources were Oriental. He divided the history into 2 types, sacred and profane, the Jews and the Christians in the first and the Muslims in the second, and 2 periods, pre- and post-Diluvian. Thus he was able to discuss such a widely divergent history as the Mughal, the Tatar, the Turkish, the Slavonic. He took in as well from all the provinces of the Muslim Empire, from the extreme Orient to the Pillars of Hercules, with their customs, rituals, traditions, commentaries, dynasties, palaces, rivers, and flora. Such work, even though it included some attention to the perverse doctrine of Muhammad, peace be upon him, qui à cause si grand dommage au christianisme, was more capaciously thorough than any work before it. Galland concluded in his discourse by assuring that the reader at length that D'Herbelot's Bibliothèque was uniquely agréable. Other Orientalists like Postel, Scaliger, Golius, Pocock, Erpenius produced Orientalist studies that were too narrowly grammatical, lexico-geographical, graphical, or the like. Only D'Herbelot was able to write a work capable of convincing European readers that the study of Oriental culture was more than just a thankless and fruitless ambition. Only he, according to Galland, attempted to form in the minds of his readers a sufficiently ample idea of what it meant to know and study the Orient, an idea that would both fill the mind and satisfy one's great previously conceived expectations. In such efforts, European discovered its capacities for encompassing and orientalizing the Orient. A certain sense of superiority appears here, and in what Galland had to say about his and D'Herbelot's Materia Orientalia, as in the work of 7th century geographers like Raphael Dumans, Europeans could perceive that the Orient was being outstripped and outdated by Western science. They stole so much science from the Orient, especially what they considered the Near Orient, from the Middle East, from South Asia. They stole so much and called it theirs. Europe would be fucking nowhere without Oriental science. But what becomes evident is not only the advantage of Western perspective, there's also the triumphant technique for taking the immense fecundity, I don't know that word. Sorry. Fertility. Have you read Braiding Sweetgrass? So fecundity means fertility. There's also the triumphant technique for taking the immense fecundity of the Orient and making it systemically, even alphabetically, knowable by Western laymen. When Galland said of Terbelote that he satisfied one's expectations, he meant that he thought that the Bibliothèque did not attempt to revise commonly received ideas about the Orient. For what the Orientalist does so is confirm the Orient in his reader's eyes, neither trying to or wanting to unsettle already firm convictions. And I am going to end that there. Actually, no. Yeah, I'm going to end it there for tonight. And good night, everybody. I shall see you all soon.